Well, good evening, everybody. I am very honored to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, a remarkable woman, a former colleague at the Justice Department, an inspiring leader, and a friend, Sally Yates. Now, I first met Sally nearly a decade ago when she was appointed the first female U.S. Attorney of the Northern District of Georgia. Sally and I were both Justice Department appointees of President Barack Obama. She was in Atlanta, I was in D.C., and together we forged a partnership on a variety of law enforcement priorities. And what always struck me about Sally, indeed, I think it's true with everyone that she meets, is her sincerity, her authenticity, her integrity, qualities on full display when during the 10 eventful days at the beginning of the current administration, Sally Yates was the acting Attorney General of the United States, and she made the difficult decision not to defend the president's travel ban. Difficult because one of the core institutional duties of the Justice Department is to defend executive orders of the president, but only if there is a legal basis to do so. And when confronted with the choice of simply deferring to a new president's prerogative, Sally chose instead to do her job and fulfill her constitutional oath, stepping into a vortex of controversy with characteristic calm and grace to make the hard but right decision. And she refused to defend the president's unlawful travel ban executive order. Now, for most Americans, this was the first time that they'd ever seen Sally Yates acting on their behalf. But the fact is, Sally has been doing justice her entire life. Not always in the glare of the national spotlight, but quietly, consistently, often without fanfare or credit, and always with the fortitude that comes from knowing that your only job every day is to go out and to do what is right. Because long before she became the personification of speaking truth to power, Sally was a career federal prosecutor who spent most of her professional life fighting for those bedrock principles that distinguish our nation from so many others: fairness, justice, equality. A graduate of the University of Georgia, Sally obtained her law degree from the University of Georgia School of Law. And after a few years in private practice, she joined the U.S. Attorney's Office, the same office that she would lead some 20 years later. And what made Sally such a great prosecutor and public servant was not just her command of the law, which is formidable, or her skills as a team leader or trial attorney, which are exceptional. No, what makes Sally so remarkable aren't the things they teach you in law school, but rather the things she shows us by her character, her honesty and humility, her candor and commitment, her lack of ego, her abundance of empathy. Perhaps it is because her roots lie deep in the South, the battlefield where so many of our shared struggles for fairness and equality have been fought. Perhaps it's because she knows the pain that comes from deep personal loss, having lost her father to suicide, and the stigma that too often isolates and shames in the wake of such great tragedy. Perhaps it's because she always appreciated how fortunate she is to have been among the lucky few in our country called to fulfill that special service in pursuit of justice at a department that bears the same name. A department that should never be partisan or political, notwithstanding the efforts of some to make it so. A department that, at its best, serves neither president nor party, but the people. Sally reminds us that such notions of public service, which can seem so quaint these days, really do represent the best of who we can be as a nation: unselfish and compassionate, principled and courageous, inclusive and unafraid. Sally reminds us of these things because Sally embodies these things. And for the gift of her service, for the gift of her courage, all of us owe her a debt of thanks. There is, wrote an Italian philosopher, there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Forging change is hard, and those who take the lead in introducing a new order do so knowing that failure is much more likely than success. And yet, they persevere. Though they may feel uncertainty, they comfort us with their confidence. Though they may harbor fear, they seem unafraid. They move through the world with a clarity born of the knowledge that they stand on the right side of history. They are, in short, a lot like my friend, Robbie Kaplan. And what makes Robbie so unique, so special, is her constant willingness to answer what Dr. King called the knock at midnight. It's that courage to stand up and speak truth, often when no one else will or no one else can. It's the courage to stand up for those who often suffer in silence, to be a voice for those who know not the mainstream of life but its margins. Indeed, Robbie often speaks in the halls of power for those who find no voice there. I first met Robbie around the same time I met Sally, actually. But unlike Sally, Robbie and I were on opposite sides of the V. I was the Assistant Attorney General of the Civil Division at the time, leading all of the Justice Department's federal civil litigation, and Robbie, well, Robbie was suing me. And although Robbie didn't know it at the time, I could not have been happier that she had chosen to sue the federal government. Because as you've already heard and no doubt know, Robbie was representing Edie Windsor in a case challenging the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, and challenging this idea that one could legalize the discrimination against same-sex couples when it came to the provision of federal benefits. And as head of the Civil Division, I was charged with the fun job of defending the constitutionality of DOMA. It was a duly passed federal statute, and that was our job. Now, the Justice Department had defended successfully DOMA in dozens of lawsuits since the law had been passed in 1996. Court after court had upheld the law's constitutionality in several federal circuits, and even though the Supreme Court had begun to cast some doubt on the reasoning of some of those lower court decisions, the fact remained that every legal challenge to DOMA that was coming across my desk was being brought in a circuit with binding precedent upholding DOMA's constitutionality. That is, until Robbie came along. Her challenge to DOMA in a circuit with no binding precedent was the catalyst that allowed many of us in the Department of Justice responsible for defending DOMA's constitutionality to review that law anew, to review it as if it were being challenged for the first time. And it was Robbie's challenge that allowed us to argue to Attorney General Eric Holder and then ultimately to President Obama, that DOMA's sanctioned discrimination against same-sex couples was both morally and legally wrong, that it was a law based on malicious and derogatory stereotypes about the LGBTQ community, that its doctrinal foundations were set in Supreme Court authority that had been overturned, and that the Justice Department should cease its defense of the law. Indeed, it was the arguments that Robbie made in trial courts on behalf of her client, Edie, that were so persuasive and finding echoes within the halls of the Department of Justice. Ultimately, her arguments became our arguments as we pressed courts around the country to declare DOMA unconstitutional. And today, we look back on that Supreme Court decision to relegate DOMA to the dustbin of history with an air of inevitability. But the truth is, but for Robbie Kaplan's tenacity, but for her persuasive advocacy, but for Robbie Kaplan's unwavering courage, it would not have happened.